Friends, I could be interviewing any guest on virtually any topic or public policy issue and ask nearly any question. But at some point in the conversation, the resounding answer is always going to be it's the economy, stupid. Advocate for government funded higher education, such as free community colleges, and someone is going to complain that doing so would wreak havoc on the economy. Dare to ask for a single payer healthcare system, such as Medicare for all here in the United States, and, well, we're told that this too will harm the economy. Demand a living wage, or even a measly increase in the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour, and, well, someone will lecture you on the disastrous effects to small business, the price increases, and the overall damage it would do to the economy. It's rather ironic, don't you think, that when it comes to anything that would improve the lives of actual people, taking the corrective steps is somehow bad for the economy. It certainly seems at times that the economy neither includes nor cares about us regular folks. And yet, a fear of destroying the economy also threatens the lives of our nation's most wealthy and powerful. Take, for instance, the example of climate change. Now, this is a crisis that poses a significant threat of near extinction for all humans. Well, for all living creatures, for that matter. Because combating the effects of global warming would be expensive, we are told that we just can't afford to do anything about it. Converting to alternate sources of energy and weaning ourselves off of the dependence that we have on fossil fuels would, once again, negatively impact the economy. So are we willing to doom all of humanity, rich and poor alike, to preserve our current way of life? Have we also become slaves to this beastly force that we know as the economy? This brings about questions such as, well, who actually controls and benefits from this economy? You know, we often forget that the economy is a human-made invention that includes all of us. So what kind of economy do we want? Do we want one, for instance, where improving the lives of citizens is harmful? Or one where our economy is at its best, when the people it serves are all prosperous? For better or worse, every aspect of our lives and society are oriented around this thing that we call the economy. It impacts the body politic of our lives. It infects the spaces where we live, dictates how we live to some degree, and to some degree even influences how long we live. Yet for all the ways in which the economy intersects with our lives, very few, myself included, seem to fully understand it, or even recognize the significant impact it has over both the macro and micro factions of daily life. Now, we hear politicians talk about the economy. It's discussed through the news constantly and debated in academia. But here again, what exactly is the economy? We tend to think of the economy as being about finance, trade, and business. Many of us who don't work on Wall Street or aren't the CEO of a large company feel detached from the concept of the economy, despite it having a tremendous impact on our lives and, of course, livelihood. When we break it down, the economy is ultimately about one thing: human behavior and the complex factors that surround it. What some consider to be fundamental laws of economics are merely guesses based on assumptions about the choices people will make and the way they will react in different situations. How much value will consumers place on a specific product? Will employees be more productive if they are paid a higher wage? Economists ask these types of questions, and business decisions are based on the speculative answers. But human behavior can be erratic and, let's face it, unpredictable. Humans are emotional. We are prone to cognitive biases. We are heavily influenced by outside sources. and they often act against their own best interests. This level of subjectivity might make it hard to build a working economy, but it also means that humans can be steered in a direction to make an economy work. Now, regardless of their motives, economic systems both exploit and influence how we behave as individuals, as a society, and even as a world. We must remember that economists, and indeed money itself, are concepts derived from human ingenuity. In a way, we are constantly being manipulated by these human-designed social experiments. The academic discipline of economics can be broken down into two major areas of study: microeconomics and macroeconomics. So what are these? Microeconomics entails the study of human behavior as individuals and collective groups, such as businesses, to understand why they make the economic decisions that they do and how these decisions affect the larger economic system. Furthermore, it studies how a particular value is attached to a product or service and examines how individuals coordinate, compete, and cooperate with each other within the economy. Macroeconomics, on the other hand, studies the larger realm, focusing on economy-wide factors, such as the impact and effect of rising prices or inflation on the economy. It aims to track and make sense of the financial indicators that are used to measure the success or failure of the economy across time and place. Numerous economies coexist, such as that of a nation, a locality, or within a single industry, and even at the household level. There are also different economic systems, such as capitalism and socialism, and various subsystems that exist within those systems. There are many definitions of the word economy, just as there are multiple theories and economic systems. It's important that we further understand the definitions. Investopedia defines an economy as a complex system of interrelated production, consumption, and exchange activities that ultimately determine how resources are allocated among all the participants. The production, consumption, and distribution of goods and services combine to fulfill the needs of those living and operating within the economy. With that in mind, I want to look at the last statement, the part about fulfilling the needs of those living and operating within the economy, that you and I. What are these needs? Who determines them? And just how are they met? Well, as we know, needs vary by population, geography, class, and, well, thousands of other variables. No needs are either equal or equally met. The economy consists of those who have and those, well, who have not. And in many ways, this inequality is perpetuated by the economy itself. The mere establishment of any economic system and its ability to function depends upon the apparatus of government. It requires a state that can enforce the laws, regulate the rules, and to some degree manufacture broad consent among the populace. Now, this can be through democratic processes or through coercion. In other words, the existence of an economic system requires the visible and capable hands of political actors, working within an established framework that is exercised through legal and political institutions. And these institutions dictate and enforce the rules which are vital for social and economic life. To this end, economics is inherently about human behavior, both working off the innate tendencies of human nature and as a constitutive system that is vested in controlling, manipulating, influencing, and moderating how humans behave as individuals in a collective society. It's important to note that no economic system can exist or function without these legal and political mechanisms. In fact, to separate economics from the political and social realm is, well, in a way, to deny reality itself. The question then is, to what extent do these alliances work together for the benefit of society as a whole? Who holds power in government, and to what end? What is the corrupting force, politics or the economy? Is it the economic systems that fail, or is it the political establishments in which they operate that are the problem? Again, these are all questions that need serious consideration. And yes, there is indeed a problem. The entirety of our world is plagued by economic stagnation, financialization, and pervasive inequality. This crisis is accompanied by mass unemployment and, for that matter, underemployment, impoverishment, hunger, wasted output, and wasted lives. And what we can only rightly call a planetary ecological death spiral. Here in America, soaring inequality in income and wealth has its counterpart in declining material circumstances for most of our country's population. This makes little sense because the United States is the world's largest economy with a GDP, or global domestic product, that far exceeds the second place runner-up, which is, you guessed it, China. So with so much abundance to work with, you would think that the United States would have found a way to spread prosperity amongst all our people. But here we aren't even close. Real wages for workers in the United States have barely budged in 40 years. And this is despite steadily rising productivity. In 2022, 69% of the total wealth in the United States belong to the top 1% of earners. And this number has been moving upward ever since 1989. America isn't even trying to bridge the gap between the ultra-wealthy and the average citizen. And why not? When research suggests that every person benefits from an economy that works for us all. In their book, The Spirit Level, Why Greater Equality Makes Society Stronger, authors Richard Wilkinson and Kay Pickett highlight the multiple deleterious effects that stem from inequalities in income and wealth. Their findings, gathered using data from 23 developed nations and separate states within the United States, reveal negative correlations between inequality and physical and mental health, education, child well-being, social mobility, trust, and community life. They also found positive correlations between inequality and drug abuse, incarceration, obesity, violence, and teenage pregnancies. These findings suggest that inequality is a chief contributor of adverse outcomes through psychosocial stresses, which are generated through interactions in an unequal society. As the title suggests, the 30 years of research behind this book culminate into a theory that economic equality would lead to a better quality of life for everyone, not just for the poor, but for the wealthy alike. Folks, on the show, you have heard me say that many, many times before, and I will probably say it a million times again. Wealth equals power. And people with the wealth and power don't want to give up either one of these advantages. Since economic systems are entirely dependent upon the state, and therefore the political and legal institutions at the helm, any solutions to economic disparity must be sought within the political system itself. A system that, unfortunately, is dominated and controlled by the wealthy and powerful. Politicians and big business alike will tenaciously protect their wealth and power, even at the expense of everyone below them on the economic ladder. The economic systems that govern the core of our society are the main drivers of the inequality and negative outcomes that plague the entirety of our world. But The people who dictate these systems need an incentive to adjust the way our economy works before we will see any real sustainable change. Perhaps the problems are not so much economical, but political. And not only do we, the people, feel that we have no power or control to change our political circumstances in a way that at least might lead to change the way our economy works, we also, let's be honest, have a fear of doing so. The American people, and this is true elsewhere as well, have a strong distrust in government. In 2015, only 23% of Americans thought they could trust the government always or most of the time. 59% had a negative opinion of the government, while 20% of respondents believed the government lacked the tools to improve equality of opportunities between the rich and the poor. Such prolific skepticism and distrust in government is, in many respects, the single most constraint on improving upon the lives of those who need it the most. And paradoxically, because many of those same people, the ones who could most benefit from more government and more government intervention especially, are likely to hold precisely these anti-government views. And let's be honest, who can blame us for this perception of government? After all, most of us have lived through years of broken promises by politicians telling us that things are going to get better, that good things are just around the corner. The 2019 Nobel Prize for Economics was awarded to MIT scientists Abhirat Banjari and Esther Duflo for their experimental approach to alleviating global poverty. In their book, Good Economics for Hard Times, they explain that the only way out of our economic struggles here in America is to adopt a much expanded role for the government. But they also tell us that our negative perception of our government, which is not accidental, prevents us from trusting them to control the economy. And again, this is a dire problem. An excerpt from the book reads, quote, "The growing economic and political influence of the rich, the result of the pursuit of the elusive elixir of growth, has combined with anti-government sentiments the rich carefully have cultivated to head off any attempts to rein in their growing wealth. The government is chronically broke because it is politically impossible to raise taxes. And even the most socially minded of the young have become convinced that government is terminally uncool," end quote. The authors go on to say that rather than fight for economic change, those with the ability to do so often give in and embrace our country's system of capitalism, hoping that perhaps it will at some point work for them. Potentially, the solution to our economic woes might lie in the people electing politicians who we can actually trust to enact policies and systems that work for and not against the average citizen. But here again, how can this happen when our political choices are so limited and corrupted? These are questions that we have to analyze. The Reverend William J. Barber II, who has been called the closest person we have to Martin Luther King in contemporary America, has asked this very question and then answered it with a form of activism he calls the fusion movement. Barber's 14-point plan is designed to create political coalitions that are organized around issues instead of parties. His aim is to band together conservatives, progressives, basically everyone, every group who is dissatisfied and seeking change in pursuit of common goals. Now, this is a lofty goal, of course. In an interview with CNN, Barber said, "There is a sleeping giant in America. Poor and low wealth folks now make up 30% of the electorate in every state and over 40% of the electorate in every state where the margin of victory for the presidency was less than 3%. If you could just get that many poor and low wealth people to vote, well, they could fundamentally shift every election in the country. Sounds simple, of course, but as we know, not so much. To conclude, I must apologize for my very basic overview of an extremely complicated topic. Folks, I am not by any stretch of the imagination an expert in economics. I barely even understand it. And that is why I brought in a more knowledgeable guest to help explain the intricacies of our country's economic system. Geoffrey Hodgson is an emeritus professor at Loughborough University in England. And he is the author of an amazing book, which I have just finished reading, called Conceptualizing Capitalism. Now, in a recent episode, last week, I believe it was, I confessed that I am a socialist at heart. But that is not to say that I am unwilling to hear the virtues of capitalism and consider the ways this economic system might be adapted in a way that brings economic equality to America. And I also want to point out, and this is especially true after reading Conceptualizing Capitalism, that all too often these labels that we associate, whether it be capitalism or socialism, are just that, labels. And they preclude us from further understanding the complex systems that exist. For instance, I learned that there's multiple versions of capitalism, each with their own merits and disadvantages. After the break, we're going to be talking with Geoffrey, and we're going to be discussing capitalism in further details. We'll be right back. And now allow me to introduce my guest, Geoffrey Hodgson.
It's a pleasure to be on your program.
Thank you so much. I have to say, I love your book. I went into the book not really understanding how much I did not understand about capitalism and about the economic system in general. And one of the things that your book did that I think is absolutely remarkable and important for people to understand any economic system is that it went into the history and the various building blocks that coalesce around capitalism, like the legal system. You really broke that down in each chapter. You went through the importance of the legal systems, different types of legal systems, and the history of capitalism from a multi-dimensional perspective. So I really appreciated that. And I want to say that I understand capitalism better, but at the same time, it's far more complex than you can really define. And you've defined, let me see if I have my notes here. Well, let me just ask you, for those who are wanting a simple answer, what is capitalism essentially?
Yeah, well, it's important to have some answer to that question, because whether we like capitalism or hate it, we need to know what we're talking about. And what I do is list some key characteristics. And the first one you've already mentioned, that's a legal system. A legal system which can deal with private property, with exchange, enforced contracts, and all that. So that has to be there. And we have imperfect capitalisms where legal systems don't work so well, but some kind of legal system is necessary. So the second feature of capitalism, which you'll find in any dictionary, is widespread markets. So you have widespread exchange, commodity exchange, competition and so on, and to different degrees in different ways, but that's a key feature. And along with that is a private property. You have the capacity to own property either as an individual or, as you say, as a group, a corporation or so on. And that has to be there, and it has to be protected by law with regulation and so on. There's two other things which I add as well, and these are important, I think, historically. One is the employment contract, because it's a feature of the world we're in that most people earn their money through a wage or salary. There's a considerable number of self-employed people as well, but the overwhelming majority of people, I did until I retired. I don't know if you're technically on an employment contract, not Sean, but most people are, right? And that's where we get our income, or at least a good part of our income. So widespread employment is one of the characteristics. But last and not least, it's the financial system of capitalism which is important. This was emphasized by a great a European economist called Joseph Schumpeter, who ended his days in Harvard, actually. Now, you've heard of Schumpeter, I guess many of the listeners have. Very important economist, and he stressed that the beating heart of capitalism was the financial system. And I've gone into this in this book and in other later writings, and it's very important, and it's very complex. It's difficult to understand. I share this mystification about this highly complex system, but we have to somehow get our head around it and see how it can work better, see where it goes wrong, see its instabilities and so on. So those basically, I've listed those key characteristics. And as you rightly say, these mixtures and these forms of institution occur in different ways in different countries, and we can talk about that. But that's basically what I'm trying to get at. So if we want to change, so we've got a choice really. We either support the existing system as the best of all possible worlds, or we try and change the existing system by modification rather than departing from capitalism. Better markets, better employment conditions, more efficient financial system that's less amenable to shocks and slumps, more stable, for example. That's tricky to do. It's not easy to do, and you can interfere with things and make them worse. But those are the kind of things we can address, and we can do that by comparing different capitalisms in Europe, in the Far East, in the US, and elsewhere. They differ in these respects, and we can learn from each other in that. So there's a possibility of reform. There's also the possibility the socialist or communist alternative is to change it. It's to abolish private property, basically to abolish most markets and so on. And that's a very radical solution. And we have experience of that working. I don't want to go into socialism too much unless you're interested, but it has problems, severe problems, and the practical experience we've seen of attempts to do that have not been that good. In fact, they've been disastrous in many ways. So my inclination, this is just my personal view, is that we better look at possible ways of reforming capitalism, and perhaps moving it in a direction of something which can benefit from other systems. But overthrowing it, I think, is a bit risky and didn't work in the past.
Is capitalism, as it exists now, sustainable?
Well, that's a very good question. I think you raised the question of climate change, and I think unless we deal with big issues like that, we have a problem. And on that, see, I don't think socialism is a solution either, because one of the great benefits of capitalism is its innovative capacity. So capitalism has been around for about 300 years, plus or minus a bit. It's a rough figure, but it's a few centuries. That's when we had a developed financial system, we had global trade and all these things. And the downsides of that, we've had slavery and all these bad things going on, inequality you've mentioned. But capitalism during that period, on the plus side, has seen tremendous innovation. We saw the Industrial Revolution in Britain, which started and then spread to other places like the US and Europe and elsewhere. Innovative capacity under capitalism is historically unparalleled. And to deal with things like climate change, we do need innovation. We need other things too. We need to, restrict consumption of various things, stop burning carbon fuels and so on, more efficient cars, electric cars, all that needs to be done. It's personal and it's corporate and it's the state. They all have to get involved. But if capitalism, the innovation that it provides for the possibilities of moving in that direction and dealing with climate change, I'm not that optimistic because the progress is too slow, but we have to keep that. Innovation is very, very important. So, it's not an easy world we're in. We're in a world of climate crisis, of instability, of growing authoritarianism in some countries. Yes. Democracy is in the number of countries which are officially democratic is going down, not up. It peaked around the year 2000, but so there's no good signs. We have right populism and left populism occurring. It's a dangerous world, but let's get our thinking hats on and our activist boots on and do something about it. And that, I think, means first of all reforming and learning from the things that work. And we can learn from capitalism in that sense.
There's a gentleman by the name of Phil Kolter, and he identified the 14 shortcomings of capitalism. And I just want to read them to you real quick. He says the current state of capitalism is falling short because it, 1, proposes little or no solution to persistent poverty. 2, generates a growing level of income inequality. Fails to pay a living wage to billions of workers, not enough human jobs in the face of growing automation, doesn't charge businesses with a full cost of their activities, which I guess we would get into as externalities. It exploits the environment and natural resources in the absence of regulation, creates business cycles and economic instability, emphasizes individualism and self-interest at the expense of community and the commons, encourages high consumer debt and leads to growing financially driven rather than producer-driven economies, lets politicians and business interests collaborate to subvert the economic interest of the majority of citizens, favors short-term profit planning over long-run investment planning, should have regulations regarding product quality, as you just mentioned, safety, truth in advertising, and anti-competitive behavior, tends to focus narrowly on GDP growth, and 14, needs to bring social values and happiness into the market equation. What is your opinion on that, on those points? Do you think that there's any merit to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Those points are very serious and well taken. There's lots of things wrong. I mean, I could add more to them. I mean, what about production of weapons for gain and feeding dictatorships with weapons so they have wars with each other? You can go on and on and on. That's all happening. And this is one of the downsides, one of the big several downsides of the system we're in. But to come back to the earlier point, and I think this is crucial, what happens with these different things is different in different countries. For example, taxation. Yes. Okay, as you've mentioned in your talk, and you're absolutely right, there's a political problem about increasing taxes. It's true for your country, for the US, and it's true for my country, the UK. Okay, but other countries have much higher levels of taxation. And in particular, I'm going to repeat these examples again. I mean, countries like Denmark and Sweden, the Nordic countries in Northern Europe, have much higher levels of taxation and much better welfare states, and they are amongst the most productive of capitalisms. It's not as if the tax is holding everyone back and everyone is sort of been driven down by a tax state. It's not the case. These are among the most dynamic and innovative of capitalist systems. They're relatively small countries, but their performance is on the record for that. So things like redistribution are more possible in some countries than others. Look at Japan, for example, as another example. Japan actually has a remarkable, exceptionally low level of wealth inequality. Okay, there's income inequality and there's wealth inequality. The Scandinavian or Nordic countries are relatively good performers on income inequality. Japan is one of the best in terms of wealth inequality. That goes back to the Meiji Restoration, 1868, when Japan was forced by American gunboats to start trading and become a capitalist country. And they did very rapidly. But what they did along the way was land reform. They redistributed the land to the peasants, actually twice over. They did twice over, also after 1945. And that meant wealth was much more equally distributed. And so it's possible, maybe sometimes under extreme circumstances, it's possible to deal with these things. And we shouldn't focus exclusively on the US. The US is a very important country, and it's a very important example. It's a big country. It's amongst the most productive. So we should always look at the US, but we should not forget that there's other countries that perform better on some of these things.
Yeah, and you mentioned Sweden. One of the things that I took away from your book that I found shocking was that a lot of capitalist thinkers, serious capitalist thinkers, from the past, actually supported redistribution. They supported universal health care, universal education, things that politicians in the United States would call socialist.
Yeah, that's right. Anyone who's studied economics or Economics 101 starts with a sort of toolkit of utility maximization, production functions, supply and demand, all that stuff. That's your Economics 101 at every US university or college where it's studied. Now, that kind of economics is sometimes called neoclassical economics. It started in the 1870s, roughly, and was developed in the following 150 years. And not everyone involved in that was a sort of raving free marketeer. Some were socialists, okay? I mean, for example, there was a French economist called Léon Walras, who made a major contribution. He's an originator of what's called general equilibrium theory, which is very trendy in economics today. Talk to professors about it. And Walras wanted a quasi-socialist system with land nationalization and worker co-ops, worker cooperatives. Right. So, and he wanted the market. He wanted to know how the market worked, and he made a theoretical contribution to answer that question: how do markets work? But the market would be supplied by worker cooperatives as well as private firms. So he was influenced by socialist ideas, which are quite different from some of the other people who worked in this area. So not everyone pioneering this basic economics was ultra free market, and some of them were socialistic. I mean, for example, Kenneth Arrow, a very famous American economist, Nobel Prize winner, a socialist. He wrote articles in favor of socialism, in a moderate kind of way, but that's what it was. I think one point I would make, if it allow me to make this quickly, would be I would, as a European, I would draw a distinction between socialism and social democracy. In the US, you tend to push these together, okay? So what we have in Sweden and Denmark and Norway is social democracy, which is a mixed economy with a very viable private sector as well as a state sector. But the private sector is more important in terms of output. Well, traditional classical socialism, which is Marx and the Marxists, plus the founder of socialism, which is Robert Owen, in about 1830, all said abolish markets, abolish private property. So that's much more extreme than social democracy. So that my kind of view would be closer to social democracy than it would be to socialism. I'd be quite critical of socialism for reasons I've hinted at already. So we can meld together these social democratic insights with a reformed capitalism. So we have a number of answers there, questions, and we need answers on how much intervention by the state, what kind of intervention works and what doesn't work. It's not obvious all the time what's best. Sometimes to leave things without regulation it can be better, or with minimal regulation. It depends on the example. It depends on the example. Those are the kind of questions we ask, and it's very complex and very tricky, and Don't ask me too much because I don't know the answers. I've got a few answers, or a few questions, but these are very concrete. They're very institutional. You have to look at the rules. You have to look at the circumstances. You have to look at history, what worked and what didn't work. That's why it's very important, and that makes it exciting. I mean, it also makes it important for developing countries. How do they build wealth? How do they get out of their poverty traps? How do they get out of their destitution? How do they move forward and become and enjoy the benefits of a higher standard of living and a better organized society and a more harmonious society, so we say? Those are big questions. We can't answer them all this time, but they're great to talk about.
In refuting the 14 points that I mentioned earlier, someone else had a list, and one of the things that he said is that, and this is probably someone who's a pure market fanatic, as you would call them. And he says that inequality is necessary for capitalism and even beneficial. Is that true? Does there have to be inequality for capitalism to exist?
Well, if everybody earns exactly the same wage, then for obvious reasons, you remove incentives. Okay, so perfect equality would be dysfunctional. Okay, so the real question is not making everyone equal or not. The real question is how much inequality is good for everyone, and how much is good for the system. And you've partly answered that question with your quotes from the Wilkinson and Pickett book, The Spirit Level, which is an excellent book. I agree with you.
Oh, it's excellent.
Which shows the bad side of inequality. Now, and also if we compare different capitalisms, I'll come back to that point again. If we compare the US and the UK on one side with the Nordic countries in Northern Europe on the other side, we see much less income inequality, particularly. And we see the benefits of that. We see more social solidarity, higher happiness levels, more, all those indicators of well-being, whether it's health or mental well-being, are on the plus side for those countries. So it's really how much. I can tolerate. I mean, I think we should be able to tolerate some disparity of income to give people incentives to work hard and to innovate and so on. Nothing wrong with that. But we have huge inequalities of wealth. I mean, just bear with me a minute. I have a couple of figures. I mean, if you take wealth, in the US, the top 1% have 34% of the wealth. That's hugely unequal. No, the top 1% owning 34% of the wealth. Those figures are from 2010. From sources which are actually in the book, which you're highlighting for me. So I could quote other figures, but I don't want to get tied up with numbers. Some of the levels of inequality we have are obscene. But also like to turn the argument against the ultra-free marketeer. I'm in favour of markets. Don't get me wrong, but I think that the idea that markets are always a panacea is the mistake here. Markets can work well. They're very important. They're a good servant, but a bad master, okay, as someone said. America is not a free market economy anymore, right? I mean, this is the big news, whether you like it or not. It's not. There's a great book by Thomas Phillipson called The Great Reversal. It's called How America Gave Up on Free Markets. And what he's referring to, and he's got lots of data, is the concentration of control of market sector in a few giant corporations in every industry. Okay, so big corporates which have this. It's also, I mentioned the general equilibrium theory. It's also raised this point in the book, Conceptualizing Capitalism. It's actually impossible for capitalism to be completely marketized.
Right.
And the reason is quite simple. For everything to be marketized, we would need futures markets for everything. Now, we have futures markets for lots of things. You've got financial futures, you can get wheat futures, and all these things. You can go onto those markets, you can buy and sell. And you're buying wheat output for Canada, part of Canada in the year 2000 2025, and you're buying and selling that. When the physical things don't yet exist, you can buy things in the future. So for complete markets across the system, we need every commodity to be marketized, including future markets. Now, one simple reason why we can't do that for everything under capitalism is because we don't have future markets for labor, right? We can't have future markets for labor because if we've bonded everyone down and saying, sign this contract at birth, this is what you're going to do until you die. A lot of people would stand up and say, that sounds a bit like slavery to me, or at least some version of serfdom. The whole point of a free society is we can quit. Well, we can say, look, I don't like this job anymore. Oh, I've got a better one over there. It's been great, but I want to go. We can do that without signing a piece of paper which bonds us to our employers for life. Now, of course, there's always legal restrictions. As you can't take information or clients when you go to a different employer. So that can be signed away. But that's quite different from bonding yourself. And students also can get endowments from a corporation or future employee to study at university, study at college, come out with qualifications, and they're bound to them for 5 years. But 5 years is not 50 years, okay? Right. Small amounts is that, but we cherish the fact at some stage and with some latitude, we say, I quit. I want to quit. I want to get another job. I want to do nothing, whatever I want to do. That's what freedom's about. And it's not being restricted at birth or age of majority, 18 or 21, whatever it is, signing something which has signed your life away. We would quite rightly regard that as a form of serfdom or slavery. Though capitalism cannot be completely free. If it was completely marketized, capitalism cannot be that. If it was completely marketized, then we would be slaves and we wouldn't be free. So it's a simple paradox, and that's why we have to sort of make do with complex answers to these very complex situations, because we have a system which is not even pure all the way through. It's a system which has different bits to it, and they function differently. I call it the impurity principle. It's never pure. Another example of that is our family arrangements. Okay, when we don't come home from work and bid with our partners, say, well, how much would you give me for doing the washing up? And how much would you give me for cleaning the kitchen? And how much would you give me? If we ran our lives like that, we may do it occasionally for fun, but if we ran our lives like that, it wouldn't be much fun anymore. The loving and caring and intimacy and give and take that we cherish in family settings is alien to a contracting world. Where everything is contracted. It's both impossible and undesirable to do that. So capitalism can't be perfectly marketized, and free markets are a partial solution to some issues. But like I already said, competition is a spur to innovation. That's one of the good things about markets. It spurs innovation. It gives people incentives to put their money behind a project which may or may not succeed and may or may not reap the designs or fulfill the dreams of the innovators, but nevertheless it gives you the opportunity to do that, and the competition between others is important as a spur, as an incentive. So there are good things about markets, but we can't treat them as a magic medicine for everything.
Now, when people hear markets, I think that they hear different things. What are markets essentially? I mean, is it like the stock market that we think of, or is it more broad and complex?
Okay, I mean, economists will use market quite liberally as a term. So in the economics textbooks, any trade will be called a market. But in ordinary conversation, if I went to your home city and said, can you show me where the local market is? You would tell me it's down the road, and there's a supermarket up there, and there's a stock exchange over there, and there's a market for this and a market for that. And that we associate it with a place, okay? And that's the old meaning of market. The original Greek word for market is agora, which also means a meeting place, central in a town. So that's this meeting quality. We can do this online now, right? So we don't need a physical space. But that kind of market is more narrowly defined, typically has stronger competition. It has rules, and it has ways of dealing with things, and ways to regulate who can trade, who can't trade, to bar bad traders or cheaters or people who create a bad reputation for the group working there, and so on. So that's a more organized notion of market. I'm happy to switch meanings, okay, here. But what I think is dangerous is where you think in terms of markets for everything. When people use terms like political markets, what does that mean? I mean, is that bribing politicians? You know, I mean, it sort of opens the door for commercial language in spheres where other things are just as important. I mean, I'm also wary of things like market for ideas. People use that term all the time. If it's a metaphor, it's relatively harmless. Okay, we're competing for ideas. You and I are spouting out ideas. We're comparing them and seeing what's right and what's wrong and forming our own opinions. That's market-like in a sense, but we're not signing. These not bits of intellectual property which we're trading, right? If I said to you, I can answer that question, but it'll cost you $10. Right? I mean, it would destroy the fun we're having. Right? I mean, and in fact, it would thwart. It would mess up the whole purpose of this dialogue, which is to understand things and to get a better understanding of what's going on between us from exchanging ideas. So, you know, language is important, and sometimes this market word is overdone. True markets are important. True markets where competition occurs and there's a pricing mechanism, so you get meaningful prices, and actors can come in and look at those prices and say, well, look, this seems to be a better way of doing it. This is more costly. That's less costly. That's very, very important. I mean, economists like Hayek and Friedman emphasize that, and they're right about that. Even though I disagree with them on other things, they're right about that function of the markets. And I think the left, generally, not just in your country, my country as well, in Europe, has kind of missed that point. It is very important. I think the left has to come to terms again with the benefits of markets, as well as, you know, the limitations which people often go on about, and quite rightly sometimes, not always, but sometimes right.
Do you think that part of the problem is, and you touched upon this earlier when you talked about how corporations have sort of, you know, eliminated competition by becoming these conglomerates. Do you think that part of the problem that we're facing, especially with inequality, has to do with the fact that we don't really have a competitive marketplace anymore?
Yeah, that's part of it. Yeah, I think if corporate power means that they have much stronger influence on the legal system, and they have, and more importantly, that they have much stronger influence on the political system. And we all know about lobbying and how it goes on, and we have lobbying scandals in the UK as well as the US. You're not unique in that respect. And these powers are inevitable when you have such concentrations of wealth and power. And some way we have to deal with that. I'm not saying we have to dismantle or nationalize our corporations, but there may be cases where we can split them up. There may be cases where we can encourage more competitors, to bring in more competitors, and to have antitrust, local regulations, that kind of thing. And economists have been there. It's a long, long story. Again, it's very complicated, but we do need to keep active about this. And Robert Reich, I think, for example, the former member of Clinton's government, has a lot to say about this, which I enjoy reading.
Yeah, I am a big fan of his as well. Now, some people, of course, would call him a socialist here in the United States.
Well, I think I've criticized, in one of my latest books, I've criticized Reich. I mean, not for his ideas, but actually for having it both ways, right? Because he backs Bernie Sanders, who says he's a socialist. I can see positive things about Bernie Sanders, but he is a socialist in the traditional sense, in the classical sense. really wanting heavy state ownership in the economy. And yet Robert Reich, while backing Saunders, writes books about improving capitalism. Right? He actually puts capitalism in the title and says he wants to make it better. You can't have it both ways. Right? You're either a socialist in which you want to abolish capitalism, or you want to reform capitalism. And I think more openness. I'm not accusing Reich of any misdemeanor here, but I think more honesty and openness is always helpful in these things, and it is difficult for the reasons you hint at to deal with that in that way. Easily said, but difficult to do, because of this banding around of words for anything. Right? Yeah. For example, people will say the National Health Service in Britain is socialist. Okay. Well, it's socialized, but it isn't socialist. I mean, I'm a British citizen. I don't own it or part of it. And it has many private elements in it. It has private providers who within this organized framework, and so these words don't really help. We need to look more concretely at what's involved.
You just gave me. You just said something that I think is very important that I hadn't considered. What would you say because we get that here in the United States too, whenever we're talking about like Medicare for all or a universal healthcare system, well, that's socialist. What's the difference between socialist and socialized?
Well, in the UK, we call it socialized because it's under state control. Okay, so it's in the Department of Health runs the system, but it delegates power regionally and to different organizations down there. But ultimately, it's run from government agencies, and it's financed through taxation, largely through taxation. There's other sources of finance, but the main source is that. And there are alternative systems like the French system and the Dutch system, which rely on insurance. Okay, so instead of using taxes, they rely on insurance, but they're still socialized in the sense that they're administered by the government, and even though private agencies are doing the insurance. And one feature of that, which is different from the US, is that the insurance is compulsory. Okay, so you don't get the problem that you have in the US of people who haven't got any means of financing serious operations and so on. So there's social provision in a sense, perhaps there's a better word than socialized. There's a social policy to provide for everyone through some form of financing, be it insurance or via taxation. And no, that's worth considering. There's problems with the British model, there's problems with other models, but it's really quite scandalous. It's possible that it's possible in modern society for people unable to finance their healthcare. I mean, personally, last year I had cancer. I had lymphoma.
Oh, no.
Unfortunately, touch wood. No, I'm fine. Thanks, Sean. I'm fine. I got through it through the NHS. One stage I went private. One stage of it. That's a long story, but most of the treatment was done free at the point of use through the NHS, and the treatment was magnificent. Great doctors, great nurses, great facilities, modern technology, all this stuff. I had all that, and I recovered. Now, if I was in the US and I didn't have insurance, I'd have a problem financing that. I mean, I don't know what the cost was, but it may come into the six figures. That's the kind of money we're talking about. And if I was super rich, it wouldn't be a problem, but anything less than super rich, it's a big dent, if not unaffordable. And that really is a problem, I think. I don't want to lecture to Americans because we can learn from Americans, but there's really a problem I think you need to fix in the US.
Yeah, and and again, like you said, part of the problem with that is the words that we use whenever we talk about these issues. Because all you got to do to shut down that conversation is say that's socialist. And that's one. Again, I want to go back to the most fascinating thing about your book, Conceptualizing Capitalism, that I learned was, and this makes a lot of sense, that capitalists understood that for capitalism to succeed, you need to have a strong education system. You need to have an educated populace.
Yeah.
And that's another thing here in the United States that we're struggling with is the financing of education.
Yeah.
You know, you go into school and you end up with this huge mountain of debt and very few job prospects.
Yeah.
In the UK, how is education done in the United Kingdom?
We have very similar problems in that respect. I mean, what the US does very well is higher education. Your university education, your research universities are world class. We have some good ones too, but we're not up to American standards in that. But below that, I think we have problems very much in common. In particular, there's a kind of underclass of people from poor parents, disillusioned, unemployed, socially excluded, living in poor housing conditions. And the children really are not encouraged or unable to benefit from education. You get vicious circles developing where poor schooling leads to poor results, leads to the more middle class parents sending their children elsewhere, and it gets worse and worse, and it becomes concentrated in areas. And you've got that problem too. We have that problem in big time. So, I mean, this point about education is really very important. I mean, capitalism has become more complex. I mean, there was a debate, it was started by Marx of all people, whether capitalism would lead to less skill or more skill. The facts are capitalism has led to more skill. But what that means is you have to learn the skills to get onto the ladder. And if you don't learn the skills, if you can't learn them because you haven't access to education, or you're not encouraged by your parents, or you haven't got the money to do it, or whatever the reason, then you're off. And those figures you gave before about stagnating real wages and poverty for the US is very real. It's also real for my country too. And education is one of the ways we have to deal with that. I mean, again, let's look at a good capitalism. A better capitalism in that way is Germany. Germany has much better skill training. It's not a perfect place, nowhere is, but it's much better skill training. And you can go through school in Germany, and most people, most young men and young women will come out with some kind of skills training. There'll be some failures, but on the whole, it's much better. And they're much more attuned to this need, which is vital in modern capitalism, particularly of the complexity of the technology. When we need much more training. I mean, 150 years ago, we could ask someone to dig a ditch. Okay, they had to be strong and they had to be well fed to be able to do it. But now people have to operate computers and spreadsheets and deal with information, make complex judgments, even at low levels of skill and low in the management hierarchies. People still have to do this. And unless they're educated, they're unable to do it well, and they won't get employed. And that really is a major issue. So I think reform of the education system sits alongside reform of the health system as necessary to deal with some of these serious problems within capitalism.
One of the other things in your book that and this kind of goes back to what I've been saying, that just blew my mind, was, again, a lot of the capitalist thinkers of the past were even proponents of a universal basic income.
Yeah. It's a bit controversial, but the support for the idea of a universal basic income across the political spectrum, from people who are very keen on using markets whenever possible, free markets, and a lesser role for the state, to people towards the socialist end of the spectrum, is support for that idea. So it's across the board. I mean, the basic idea, and it comes from, among others, Thomas Paine, who's famous in your country, right, and he's famous in my country, right? Because he had a lively time in both of them. He had to flee my country because he was committing treason and perjury, and he went to your country and helped with your revolution. So Thomas Paine is a great figure. I mean, he was in favor of free markets. He was in favor of private property, but he saw the need to deal with basic problems like inequality and education and healthcare and so on. And what he proposed was a basic income, and in two forms. One was a grant to people when they reach the age of majority, which would be 18 in most countries now. So they get a grant, and that's financed out of inheritance tax. So this is a way of making inheritance tax, which is a wealth tax. People say, oh my God, no, we can't do that. But to make it popular, you say the money coming from that, from the rich, is going to be distributed to everyone when they reach the age of 18, so that they can educate themselves and give them the freedom to decide. You have to give people, you have to trust people. Some people are going to get it wrong. They're going to blow the money on alcohol or whatever, or having a good time. But I mean, you have to give people that right. So you have that right installed for everyone in replacement for having inheritance tax. Another form of basic income is a weekly or monthly check, which you get to finance you for the basics. Now, the big controversy here is how big can that be? And if it's very big, then obviously it creates a fiscal problem, which has to be discussed. But I think there's a case for having a moderate or small basic income. There's been experiments with this, and by and large, they've been reasonably successful, just simply to stop the deprivation and destitution that sometimes occurs when people lose their jobs, or they get sick, or they have a sick one to have to care for. Those are disastrous outcomes, often of nobody's fault, no one's responsibility. Sickness we don't design to have most of the time. And this is a safety net for everyone. And in a civilized society, we have to talk about safety nets. We have to talk about care for people on that. So there's a whole array of things which, the problems you listed with capitalism, which are very real, including poverty and inequality, have to be chipped away with these measures. And I'm in favour of universal basic income. The level it should be, I think, is more complex, more difficult to answer. But let's work on it.
Let me ask you, is one of the problems with capitalism and inequality the profit, the issue of profits? Because I understand the need for competition, but it seems to me that one of the problems with these competitive markets is ultimately at the very top, you've got people that are looking to profit, and that means reducing costs, making wages low. And some of that is necessary for competition, right? Because you want to have a product that people are going to want, first off, a quality product, but a product that people can afford. So it seems like the profit motive is problematic at most every level.
Yeah, I slightly differ on that, because I think the problem isn't profit as such, right? We need a profit motive to actually deal with uncertainty, with possible change, contingency. And I've been involved with small businesses and running associations where you have income and expenditure, and we all know that we face uncertain events, and things may go wrong, things may fail, or there may be a problem of some kind which is expensive to fix. So you do need margins over the top, and if you call that profit, then I think it's okay. I think I need that incentive element. So again, I think this is a case where the left has got it wrong. The left is seeing profit as always a dirty word, and I think that's wrong. It's like markets; it's not always a dirty word. It depends how they function. One potential problem with profits is super profits. And things like rewarding shareholders with dividends when the services are not matched by that improvement in profit. So profits are going up, but the level of service and the quality of service are not going up. Now, to some extent, competition can fix that, but as I said, in modern capitalism, there's often not enough competition to fix that. So we have to regulate that kind of thing. And we have corporation taxes and so on to deal with that. So another problem is the shift, which is not in your country and my country, which started in the 1970s, of putting shareholder value first. Okay, So
Right.
corporations, both through doctrine and ideology, and also through legislation, corporations are obliged to put their shareholders first. I mean, the great architect of this was Milton Friedman from Chicago, Nobel Prize economist. And I think he's fundamentally wrong. And I think that there's a lot of evidence to suggest this had serious adverse effects. The alternative is stakeholder capitalism. And lots of people have advanced this model of stakeholder capitalism rather than shareholder capitalism. And stakeholder capitalism is where everyone who has a stake in the well-being of the enterprise has some kind of influence over it, and not necessarily through a vote or thing, but they have to be taken account of. So we don't just maximize profits for the shareholders. We look at what the enterprise is doing, for example, for the environment. Is it emitting loads of CO2? Is it screwing up the water basins? Is it putting effluent into rivers? If it is, the stakeholders, which are you and me, and the people enjoying natural spaces and so on, should rightly complain and have some legal leverage over the corporation for doing that. I know to some extent they have that already, but we need more of that kind of thing. And we need a different model of how corporations work in a capitalist society. So stakeholder rather than shareholder primacy. And that's to some extent what was there before. We need to reverse this shareholder primacy and go back to that. A lot of people are writing on this. It's not something which is confined to my work. A lot of people have raised this point, and there's a lot of good evidence to back this argument up, I think.
Well, but here's the thing, though, and here's where I get perplexed, I guess, is my problem with the whole profit incentive is that it's simply not profitable, it seems, for a company to care about the communities in which they operate. Now, part of that might just be greed, but that still is kind of associated with this profit motive. How do we regulate greed so that the profit motives do not impact negatively upon the community and society as a whole?
Yeah, precisely by regulation. I mean, caring for the environment as an example, caring for employees as another example, looking at people who are impacted by the factories, the pollution, by the effects of the products, by the waste that's created. All those things have to be regulated. Now, and I can see perhaps some of your listeners are worrying that this. Oh, again, we have the monster state again intervening everywhere. A lot of this regulation can be done at a local level, and we have a lot of regulation already anyway, right? I mean, simply to produce something, you need a legal definition of what it is. When I couldn't legally go into the United States and distill my own alcohol and sell it at the local liquor store. Okay, I'd be committing an illegal act. And quite rightly, I would get prosecuted for it. So we need some kind of regulation to stop people doing bootleg liquor and selling it as legitimate liquor products in liquor stores. So we do this all the time. We have to do it carefully. We have to do it in an informed way. We have to involve people in making those decisions. Big order, but it's absolutely inescapable. Give you an illustration of this. I don't know if you know much about Brexit, what's happened in the UK in the last few years. We've left the European Union. So more than a quarter of small businesses in Britain are going bust because of the end of regulations governing exports to the European Union. Okay, so if you remove the regulations, you say to people in Britain, oh, you can do what you want now. You don't have, so when you produce an electrical product, you don't have to comply with this regulation and that one. Yeah, you can do what you want, but you can't sell it in Europe anymore because they won't accept it. To sell it in Europe, it has to comply with the regulations. So here's an example where you could sweep in got rid of huge numbers of regulations, and a quarter of small businesses are going bust. It's catastrophic. We've removed regulations on a scale which is unprecedented in our history. As a result, the economy is going down the toilet. Regulation can be a good thing, particularly if you're dealing with international trade and you want regulatory compliance. I mean, you can't sell any old car as a car in Europe unless it complies with all the emissions regulations, all the regulations concerning safety, has seatbelts installed, it doesn't pollute the atmosphere so much, and so on. You have to do it, right? That's the way of the world.
Yeah. And because we have a problem here in the United States too, anytime you mention regulation, people push back, oh, it's a bad thing, it hurts businesses, it's bad. Again, it's bad for the economy. But as you pointed out, the adverse is true. It's bad for the economy to not have regulations.
It's possible to have overregulation, right? I mean, I'll give you an example. Yeah, it's possible. I'll give you an example. I'm very fond of France. I've spent quite a bit of time in France, and I've got lots of French friends. And one of the problems their economy has is over-regulation of employment relations. Okay, we had a friend who was a small-scale employer in France. He employed people, and he explained that actually the regulations were so stringent that if you hired someone and they were there for more than a short time, say 3 months or whatever, you couldn't get rid of them. You couldn't sack them for being incompetent. I mean, because the regulation book is that thick and it's got all these things in it which prevent you doing it. So that's, I think, the French, and Macron is trying to deal with this. But Macron gets called all sorts of words by the left because he's trying to sort a real problem. He's trying to streamline the regulations. He doesn't want to get rid of them, but he wants to make them work better for the French economy. So the left hate him. They make him as a sort of paragon of the right, nasty. But actually, what he's doing, by and large, mostly as far as I can see, is quite sensible. And we need we need workers' rights. I mean, workers need rights to be treated well, to have good environmental conditions, not to be subject to unwarranted risks or for the environment or legal risks or whatever. All those things are very important, but there's a kind of you can't. It's not unlimited. You have to have some practical measure which allows some fluidity of employment and to occur, protecting workers' rights as well, and giving them access to education to retrain as something else. So there's all sorts of examples like this where we have better models in other countries and worse models in other countries. And the French employment regulations, I think, are one of the bad models. France does other things very well. The transport system, it does very well. Its healthcare system is better than yours and it's better than mine. And lots of things it does well, but some things it does badly.
Yeah. I'm looking for. Let me just look at my notes here real quick, because in your book, there was an excellent part of your book that I found absolutely that I wanted to talk about. The importance of the state in the emergence of capitalism is already well established in numerous studies of law, property rights, markets, banking, manufacturing, and so on. A key factor was the development of a new and sophisticated state machine that was strong enough to protect property and trade, but adequately restrained by checks and balances to countervailing power, to minimize the confiscation and overtaxation, to protect a relatively autonomous legal system, and allow the development of self-governing organizational forms that could engage in productive activity and reap the rewards of innovation. And I found that passage of your book to be quite interesting, because it does go to the idea of a state that has sort of this balance of power, right?
Yeah.
And elsewhere in the book too, you point out that capitalism is utterly dependent upon the state, that the state and the legal system had to come first and kind of conform to a certain environment for capitalism to thrive. And as you just mentioned, in France, of course, you've got a problem where the government may have overstepped. And my question to you is, how do we, first off, is that sort of not a problem in itself, that capitalism sort of requires a certain type of state, a certain type of government?
Yeah, absolutely. It is a problem. It's a necessity, but it's a necessity that creates its own problem. That's why the point which you quoted about countervailing power is very important. This has been stressed by a number of American economists, including Douglas North, John Kenneth Galbraith, several others talk about countervailing power. And it's by some flukes of history, your country and my country created those elements of countervailing power. They're imperfect, and we need to look at them and see if they're working well. But without that, you get nasty things occurring. You get concentrations of power and potential corruption. Look at Putin's Russia, for example. It is still nominally a democracy, but the democratic apparatus is totally manipulated, including the media, by Putin, and using assassination against people he doesn't like, journalists he doesn't like, business people he doesn't like, and so on. So it's a degeneration of a model where there's insufficient countervailing power. When if there's a topic I think that really needs much deeper research, and if any of your listeners are aspiring PhD students in the social sciences, in politics or economics, I would suggest that countervailing power is a key problem, whether you approach that historically, analytically, through some data set or whatever. We need more work on that. We need to know how it works. But the fact is, we had it and we got it. Your country got it in a sort of ramshackle way, and my country got it in an even more ramshackle way. But it kind of worked. I mean, and Douglas North, who I knew personally, by the way, great guy. Douglas North emphasised the counterbalance between the crown, the monarchy, and Parliament. And I don't think he got all the details right, but his basic point was absolutely spot on, that you needed that counterbalance. Now, you have a more complex system of checks and balances, but they're built into your constitution. You have the federal state, and you have the federal apparatus, government apparatus, and you have the state level apparatus. And within those, at every level, there's checks and balances. And there's alternative senses of power. In both cases, we have the problem with these large corporations, which are perhaps getting too much power. Okay, yes. So we have to look at that, and that's one of the things that your aspiring PhD student might look at, is the role of corporate power in a polycentric or countervailing power system. But your other point is spot on. Like it or hate it, the state has been necessary to get a lot of things done. I mean, a lot of economists, a lot of social scientists emphasize spontaneous order and spontaneous development of arrangements. Right. Some things do emerge that way. But you look at example after example after example, the spontaneous mechanisms can only get you so far. I mean, the financial system is a case. The origins of the British financial system, which are basically through the 17th and 18th centuries, were acts of legislation, and less by common law courts and more by statutes from the top, through the justice system at the top, through national level legislation. And that occurred several times over to make financial markets work. As I said, through the 17th and the 18th century. It's an interesting story, but I'm going into details. Factory regulations in the 19th century required state intervention to stop employers exploiting workers and making them work 18-hour days and all the rest of it. And stop them employing children, child labour and female labour and unregulated female labour and all that stuff going on. I mean, children are cheap labour, but they should be educated so that they can play a fuller part, even as workers and as citizens in a modern economy. So those things have to be regulated and banned in some cases, limited. We still see cases around the world where they're still there. Unfortunately, they have to be dealt with in some way. So the state was involved at every step. Not entirely. It wasn't always right, and it wasn't always wise in what it tried to do, and it made mistakes. But the steps forward were often orchestrated by the state with the help of private interests, lobbying, and all these things going on as well. And another problem is getting rid of or minimizing corruption. And corruption is a big problem in many countries. Well, I mean, we see examples in our press in the US of corruption, and also in the UK. It seems to be getting worse here. But other countries have it much worse than we do. Much, much worse. Everything is corrupt. You know, getting a degree is corrupt. You have to bribe someone to get this certificate, and you know, getting a passport to go abroad, you have to bribe someone to do that. And you have to bribe someone to get a seat on a train. All these things go on in places like India, where corruption is rife, and China as well, just as bad. So there's a big problem.
Is corruption a feature of capitalism, do you think?
I mean, yeah. I mean, in a sense, corruption is the natural order of things. I mean, we all like to do favors for our friends, don't we? I'm not being cynical. I'm being honest here, right? You make friends with someone, you like to help them. Okay, so we have the beginnings of nepotism and potential corruption in doing that. Now, hopefully, most of us will not be literally corrupt in that we bend rules or act illegally to help someone else. You know, we would draw the line at that. But you know, helping each other within families and close friends and extended families, it is the way the world works, and not necessarily a bad thing either. So we have to really, corruption is natural in a sense. It's a word I use cautiously, but so you need measures to minimize it and measures to bring it down to tolerable levels. And that's part of the role of the state. And for that to happen, the state has to be relatively uncorrupt too. So there's a circle to square, which is really difficult to do. By the way, corruption in Britain was lowered partly because we were fighting wars. And we were fighting the French and others for the best part of over 100 years, from 1688 to 1815, Battle of Waterloo. Much of that time we were fighting French and French allies. And we knew that at times in that period, over 100 years, so we were completely isolated. We also, had to fight a war to try and prevent the US becoming independent. We lost that one, okay? But the effects of those losses were sufficiently worrying for the British administration to actually try and reduce corruption. And actually it did. Quite markedly. So by the early 19th century, state corruption has gone down. It's not abolished, but it's gone down quite considerably. And public administration is less amenable to it, and so on. So these are very complicated things, and they're very pressing for countries that are trying to develop in Africa, South America, Far East, and so on.
Well, one of the things too that you address in your book is the fact that corruption is actually bad for capitalism.
Yes, and that reinforces the point that the rules have to be followed and there has to be enforcement. So part of the enforcement doesn't have to be the state. You can have professional associations or monitoring by groups. So hopefully, associations of doctors and medical experts will self-regulate to a large degree and prevent corruption or minimize corruption occurring or malpractice occurring. Similar things happen in the teaching profession and elsewhere. So a lot of this can be devolved down from the state, but the state also has to play a role and has to recognize breaches of legal rules for corrupt purposes as being prosecutable and have effective prosecution when that occurs. In many cases, in your country and mine, it doesn't happen, but
Right.
That's the way things are. And we as alert citizens have to press for justice here.
Yeah, absolutely. So when it seems like a lot of people, at least in America, have a very negative view of capitalism. I want to read you some statistics that are kind of shocking, and I just want to ask you what. So this was a study by Harvard, a Harvard University study that said. A study by Harvard University showing that 51% of Americans between the ages of 18 and 29 no longer support the system of capitalism, and asked whether Democrats could embrace this fast-changing reality and stake out a clear contrast to right-wing economics. It is not young voters who feel this way. A YouGov poll in 2015 found that 64% of Britons believe that capitalism is unfair and makes inequality worse. Even in the United States, it's as high as 55%. In Germany, a solid 77% are skeptical of capitalism. Meanwhile, a full 3/4 of people, and I lost my notes there, but what do you think that it is that people are distrustful about capitalism? Do you think it's the crony capitalism? Do you think it's the corruption? It just seems like people do not think that capitalism is working for them anymore.
Yeah, and I can understand that reaction. I wouldn't take the same view, but I understand that people are worried about a number of serious problems. I think that worry got worse since 2008. In 2008, we had the big crash, right? A big financial crash, which affected both our countries very, very seriously. And I think people's faith in this system, which was meant to be wonderful, meant to be working, and markets were meant to be doing things beneficially all the time or most of the time. This wasn't a minor adjustment. This wasn't a minor downturn. This was a huge crash in the markets, which threatened the very existence of a large number of major banks, and with that, a large number of private corporations. And again, the state had to rescue the financial system for good reasons. It could have done it a little bit better in some ways, and made mistakes in doing so. But on the whole, that was necessary, and the political leaders in your country and my country basically had the right instinct there to do that. But that actually had a big negative effect on people's perceptions of the system, because we'd put up with wars, we put up with inequality, and now the very markets which are central to capitalism are collapsing in front of people's eyes. And that really was an important moment. And that has led to a rise in sort of left ideas, left populism. And the problem is that you ask a socialist, I mean, I'm not talking about people who are non-socialist, labeling everybody, people who label themselves as socialists. Often, I'm not talking about you, but often people I talk to elsewhere in this country can't answer the question, what is socialism? Okay, so it's a gut feeling against the system, which is in many ways well motivated, because people are rightly concerned about inequality, poverty, unemployment, all those things. And socialism is just a word that comes down that you wave in front of people, the people wave in front of you, and they say it's a solution. And we need some serious thinking about this. If I might criticize my fellow economists a bit, I mean, I let them off the hook too much, really. I mean, there have been great debates in the 20th century of socialism versus capitalism. There was one in the 1930s, and it spilled over, and there's been other eruptions of this debate. That stuff is not taught at all on economics courses, with a few exceptions, right? But I've been to lots of universities in the US and the UK, and by and large, this stuff is not taught. People are not taught, the merits and demerits of two great systems. And as you say, the Merriam-Webster, people are looking up the words socialism and capitalism all the time. I think one year they were ranked the two most referred to words. I don't know if they still are in Merriam-Webster, but they're up there still, I'm sure. And people want to know, right? But often, most socialists can't answer the question, what is socialism? So, I mean, I've written on this. I've written another book. I don't want to plug my books too much. You'll be very kind.
Oh, no, please, because, no.
Is socialism feasible? It was in my 2019 book. And I go into this, and I end up with a social democratic story. I say, well, look, socialism is classically defined is a disaster, okay? And if you want small-scale socialism, like worker cooperatives and communes, you must have markets. If you don't have markets, they won't work, right? If you want large-scale socialism, which is basically Bernie Sanders nationalization from the downwards top, sounds nice, sounds like it might work, never has, never will. And the reason is it concentrates too much power, much more than even a large corporation has in the US at present. It's all concentrated in the power of the state. And that undermines democracy because you lack countervailing power. That's why the issue of countervailing power is very, very important. So all attempts to do that, including most recently in Venezuela, which I think is a very interesting case study, started off with great hope, with Chavez, with the poor for the poor and all the rest of it, ended up as a totalitarian nightmare. And that's not simply because Chavez died and was replaced by Maduro. It's for the rot had set in when Chavez was in power, even when he was in power. So we have really good historical examples of why that fails. So the good bits of socialism, which are welfare state, social provision, caring for people, and also things like using cooperatives. You have lots of co-ops in the States. Do people call those socialists? They really are. They're the best we can do with socialism because people cooperate and in different enterprises. And that's the bit that does work. It's a small part of socialism. It does work in a more liberal, more pluralist, mixed economy with a conventional private sector and state intervention and regulation, all those other things. I'm in favor of this experimental mixture, and socialism won't work in that way. So I'm trying to disillusion some of my socialist friends away from this idea that this is a particularly good slogan, and say, well, if you want social democracy, we're talking now. We've got good examples of that working. Let's try and make it work better somewhere else. So yeah,
now, are there some examples though where nationalization makes sense? Like some industries, I mean, like healthcare, for instance, has been nationalized in your country. I guess you could kind of say. So
yeah, I don't want to be pedantic. It's not strictly because there's private provision within the national health service. It's state run. But we have. I mean, there's an argument about things which are called natural monopolies, and an example of that would be water supply, right?
Right.
So it's a water supply. You have a pipe coming from the local district, from the local waterworks, comes to your home, and you take the tap water, and you hope the water's not polluted and it's pure and is drinkable and so on. Now, you can't have competing water companies competing with the best water very easily. It'll become cumbersome, expensive, and so on. So economists call that a natural monopoly. So there's a case for saying let's nationalize that and let's build in regulatory mechanisms with community participation and monitoring and all the rest of it to make sure it works well and deal with the problems of government bureaucracy and so on. When the bureaucracy and nepotism, which is in the British privatized water system, is quite jaw-dropping, right? I mean, the quality of water going down, but the shareholder dividends going up in the opposite directions. Quite obviously reported all the time, with sewage being dumped into rivers and into the sea. All this going on in the British case with a privatized system, which is poorly regulated. And so with water, I say, well, let's nationalize it. Other things are more complicated. We basically have to be pragmatic. We have to see what works best. So we use examples from different countries, compare them. Does it work best? Maybe experiment in one region before we do it in another. Like in America, you do it in one state rather than another. Experimentation is very important because precisely because the world is complex, we cannot foresee all the outcomes. So simple solutions like socialism don't take this complexity on board. But sometimes, we can find sufficient evidence to support something like nationalizing water.
Now, you said that Bernie Sanders is a blanket socialist. Now, he touts himself as a democratic socialist, which can you kind of differentiate that a little bit for me?
Yeah. I mean, no socialists. I mean, there's a lot of socialists in the Labour Party. I mean, the former leader of the Labour Party in the UK was Jeremy Corbyn, and he called himself a democratic socialist. So they want to be democratic. What they don't realise is that if you concentrate all that power in the hands of the state, democracy won't have much life in it. I mean, and the lack of countervailing power, of economic and political countervailing power, is treacherous for democracy, and we have no example of that working. So the democracy is a wish. It's also, in some sense, a dangerous wish, because I'm a Democrat. I believe in democratic representative democracy and checks and balances in that way, but I don't believe in everyone making democratic decisions on everything all the time. Okay, and some of these wish lists that socialists come up with about democratic socialism seem to involve that. We're having meetings all the time. We'll be discussing any change in the system all the time. There's a wonderful remark by Oscar Wilde. I'm sure you've heard of Oscar Wilde, the British writer, or Irish white writer. Let's get his origins right. He said, socialism is impossible because it would take too many meetings. I think there's a wonderful, bitter irony to that. And he called himself a kind of socialist, but he grasped the problem, that endlessly discussing these things all the time wouldn't work. Another example, which is very fun and historically eliminating, is the experience of the attempts at socialism by the European settlers coming to your country in the 19th century. There's a big database of socialist experiments, communal experiments, generally call themselves socialist. Some were Owenite, so they're after Robert Owen, who called himself a socialist, and some were Fourierite, after a French socialist called Charles Fourier. And they were the secular versions, and there were religious versions. So like the Shakers, communities, the Amish, another example. And these had a communal, socialist style sharing living, often not sharing their property together. And the secular ones had a disastrous failure rate. The average length of time they survived was about 3 years. Whereas the Amish and the Shakers went on for decades and decades, much, much longer. And the reason is, it's rather ironic. The reason is that religion stopped people arguing about the rules. Right? If you have a religious authority and a scripture which you're trying to adhere to, you can't argue too much about it. And if you have an authority figure, a charismatic religious leader who says that it's the word of God you do this, religion has the effect of keeping people in line, for good or bad. Okay, I'm not plugging religion. I'm simply stating the facts. If you have a secular version of this, people argued all the time about the rules, and they just fell apart. Okay. Now, the solution to that problem for the secular side is market competition. Right? If you have communes or worker collectives or socialist units which are competing against each other, then that imparts some discipline. That couldn't happen in the US at the time because the dispersal of these communities was too great and market interaction was too limited. But in the modern context, that would work. I would suggest, or might work. So it's a fascinating story here of how socialism failed in various forms. We know the big stories about the dictatorial nature, the famines and the purges which occurred in Soviet Union and Mao's China and so on. These big tragic stories. We know about those. But also the small-scale socialist experiments, many of those failed too, tragically. So socialists need to know what they mean by socialism and look at their own history and have some answers to how to make it work if they want to make it work. But actually, I think a lot of people that call themselves socialists are actually social democrats.
Yeah, and I would say that that's myself as well. You know,
Yeah,
I mean, I look at Sweden very fondly. They
yeah,
have excellent systems, and but the words too, and that's why I love that you, in your book, you went into such great detail about the evolution of capitalism and the necessities involved and the various types of capitalists that exist. Um, I think that what we need to do is we need to look beyond the labels and we need to pick and choose what works, you know, what we know doesn't work, and find solutions that are new, and integrate those into the systems that we have now. But politically,
absolutely
it
right.
just means that's impossible to do.
Yeah, well, it doesn't mean we're not being radical, because some of these solutions do require some radical effort. I mean, and not to turn things, but actually to get to the roots of the problems, which is literally what being radical means. But being constructive and pragmatic and experimental, and recognizing the complexity of the world, which you've emphasized several times already in this talk, in our dialogue, and that means we cannot predict whether things work or not. We can get a better idea by looking at history and by looking at other countries, and then we try and we experiment and we move forward. And it's kind of more modest, experimental, conjectural kind of politics that we need, which does address the root problems at the same time.
Yeah, and I want to ask you real quick. I know we're running out of time, but you mentioned in your book too that the use of the terms left and right have been perverted, and I wonder if you could just kind of explain that a little bit for me.
Yeah, I mean, this is looking up the origins of these words. I mean, etymology is quite interesting. The origins of the words left and right come from the French Revolution, which had created a lot of ideas which we still use today, liberal ideas and so on. And the left sat on the left of the president and the right sat on the right. And what characterized these two positions was the right were defending the monarchy. The revolution occurred, 1789, but the king was still there. So what do we do with the king? Do we allow him to carry on as a monarch with less power, or do we chop his head off, or whatever? Okay, they ended up, of course, chopping his head off. But okay, that was debated for a good part of 3 or 4 years before they made a decision. And the ones that on the right were defending the monarchy in some form or another, and also the power of the church, which is very important. So, you know, France had religious wars, and the Catholics were on the ascendancy at the end of that period, and they wanted to defend the supremacy and privileges of the Catholic Church. Now, the left, by contrast, were actually very libertarian, or like some libertarians that we find in your country, in my country. They believe very, very passionately in what they call the rights of man, rights of human beings. Thomas Paine was part of this because he sat in the French Parliament and very nearly got executed himself, but escaped. And the liberty, égalité, fraternité was the slogan: liberty, equality, and fraternity, or solidarity, if you like. Those ideas became laid down. They were associated with the left. But in terms of economic policy, they also disliked state monopolies. The left disliked state monopolies. The left disliked nationalization, okay? And they disliked large private corporations, and they wanted smaller units, more competition in markets where everyone was free and able to operate within respecting each other's rights. So left meant something very, very different. Okay, and now by some process lasting 200 years, more or less swap position. Okay, so now being left means you're against markets, you're against private property, you're in favor of state monopoly. All those things would be right wing before. Okay, and there's an ambiguity with the term right, which is particularly awkward, because the right means two sets of things. It means dictators like Hitler. Okay, he was right wing. Nationalists, right wing. We would say Trump was right wing because he's a nationalist, and putting America first, a very strong nationalist rhetoric. So those kind of elements we would describe as right, and that would be the same for the right in 1789. But also we describe libertarian free marketeers as right wing as well, which is quite different. Sometimes the two collide. Okay, there's a bit of a sordid history here of Chicago involvement in Pinochet's regime in Chile, and also Hayek was involved a bit. It's complex, the story. I don't want to oversimplify it, but the Chicago kind of free market economics did get associated in some way with right-wing regimes here and there. And I go into that in a bit. It is a complex story, but that's in some senses against their nature, because they call themselves classical liberals, which means that they would hark back to the French tradition, which would mean something quite different. I think the difference is really about democracy, because Friedman and Hayek and others, said they were democratic, but they weren't that keen on the idea, and I think they had too many reservations about a representative democracy. So when Pinochet gets rid of democracy and restores a more free enterprise economy, then Hayek said, "Well, I'll ignore the democratic deficit here. I'll just applaud the free market stuff." So that complicates the picture. So actually, in a way, because it's become complicated, it's made communication difficult. So often I say, friends say to me, "You've gone awfully right wing, Geoff." I say, "Sorry, I haven't. I've actually moved further left." Right? And they say, "What? What?" And I explain to them, and they go away. So it's a kind of fun conversation to have with people. So some of these labels are pretty well worn out,
Yes.
Yes. We shouldn't throw everything away. We shouldn't throw language away, but too often people use a label to dismiss something and don't engage with it. So whether you like Hayek's political views or not, Hayek is a fascinating and important writer, and every social scientist at least, and general public to a degree as well, should read Hayek and read The Road to Serfdom. A great book. You don't have to agree with everything, but you can see the power of his arguments, and maybe see what's wrong with them. You can develop your own criticism of them if you wish. But people say, well, that's neoliberal, or that's right wing, and that's the end of the conversation. So we're all people that like to move amongst our own kind. We form clubs and units, and we go to the bars together with groups of mates who think alike. We tend to forget we need conversation with people outside our group sometimes.
Absolutely. You have a new book coming out that I'm very eager to read. It comes out this year. Can you tell us a little bit about your new book?
Yeah, it's a kind of companion volume to Conceptualizing Capitalism. Conceptualizing Capitalism is about what is capitalism and the varieties. You've summed it up great. The new book is called The Wealth of a Nation, Princeton University Press, coming out this year. And it's just about England, and it's how England became a capitalist. So it's the how. What was the mechanisms involved? in England becoming capitalism. And it's covering basically the period from the 14th century up to the early 19th century, when the legal institutions, other institutions were built up and enabled the Industrial Revolution, huge increase in wealth and imperial power too. Britain became a major world power in that period, all the downsides of that. So it's a history of that, and it has lessons about development in other countries, which I think are important too.
Absolutely. Yeah, I cannot wait. When does it come out exactly? Do you have a
September.
date yet? September.
September, yeah.
Oh, that's a long
Late
ways
September.
away.
It is. I haven't done the proofs yet. The proofs arrive next week. So I've done the copy editing. You know, anyone who's written anything has to go through this ordeal.
Yeah.
I mean, you're helped by these great copy editors that really help you and improve your language, and then you have to go through the proofs. And if you miss things, you know, it's a mistake. You say, "Oh God, I missed that." It feels terrible. So you try and get everything right. You try and smooth the language and get every fact checked, double checked. So that's what us authors have to do. It's part of the job.
How long did it take you to do conceptualizing capitalism? Because I mean, you go into so much depth.
Yeah.
More so than most people probably think necessary, but it is necessary because I mean, etymology. You talk about the etymology of words.
Yeah.
I mean, you really go through defining capitalism in all of its essence, and I think if we're going to have a conversation about socialism, capitalism, or economics, we have to understand it, and that's exactly what your book, Conceptualizing Capitalism, does. Is it goes through all of these various elements, and it really makes you think.
Well, thanks, Sean. That's very kind words. I hope you're right. I mean, I hope other readers benefit from it too. It takes a long time. I was fortunate in my career that I got what's in Britain we call a research chair. They're fairly rare things. I got this in 1999, which is more than 20 years ago. Before I retired more recently, and this was at the University of Hertfordshire, a previous university. And they were great with me. They just said, you know, as long as you produce stuff from reputable outlets, Geoff, you just get on with it. And administration was voluntary and teaching was voluntary. It was just a great contract. And they gave me this time, and I've been very, very lucky. I'm extremely lucky, and I'm grateful to them and all the other people who helped me with these things. But there's no way of avoiding the fact that it just takes a lot of work. See, another thing is, and I don't expect every academic and every colleague to be like this. On the contrary, I think it's for a minority, including me, and that is to be multidisciplinary. I mean, I had to learn a lot of law, for example. I'd never been trained as a lawyer. I had to learn about it. I've got friends who are lawyers, academic friends, who helped me with this and told me what to read and gave me the necessary advice. And hopefully I come through on that. But that's an illuminating experience because law is so important, and how the mechanics of law, what things mean, and property law, and all these things. So the help of others and spanning disciplines, and that in a sense is my style. That is my kind. A lot of people get benefit from specialization. They dig deep, and I admire those kind of people too. They dig deep, they test, they get data, they check the data, they go through it, they write various tests, robustness, and so on. That too is good work. That can be well done, and I admire those colleagues. We're all different, and some of us have got skills in some areas and some in others. My luck has been to benefit from that. So my career path has been lucky and probably quite unique. And in my retirement, with my health back on keel, I'm still writing a lot. I'm working on things and enjoying it. Hopefully do so for a few more years yet.
Yes. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us. Again, I love the book. I cannot wait to read your latest book. Have to wait till September for that, but okay. Is there anything that you'd like to add, or did I miss anything in our conversation?
And first of all, I want to thank you, Sean, and your colleagues for arranging this. It's been a wonderful way of spending a couple of hours. Also, I'll encourage, if people want to contact me and want any suggestions or help, please do so. You can Google me. Make sure you got the right person at Geoffrey Hodgson. I got a website. Right. But get the right person, get me. You'll find it on Google, and I'll be happy to talk to you and help you if I can. So it's been a great experience, and good luck with your future discussions, including socialism and all the important things that you're raising.
Thank you so much. And folks, we will see you next Tuesday. This is